One thing we saw in the last lecture is that the alphabetic approach to writing is not something that was immediately intuitive to human beings, and that even today, that is not the basis of a great many writing systems in the world. And in general, the development of writing systems and writing systems themselves are interesting not only in terms of the fact that they represent a clinal procession towards an alphabetic system, but just in the sheer variety of them that are still thriving today based on all sorts of perspectives, all sorts of linkages of writing with the sounds that come out of our mouths. And in this lecture, we will take a look at some other writing systems around the world that operate on principles very different from what we naturally think of as ordinary in a society where our writing system happens to be an alphabet. And I think that in terms of just appreciating diversity in terms of writing systems, that it certainly helps to have a sense of what's going on with the Chinese writing system. And this is because it's very much around us in most places in the United States. It's increasingly around us in many ways. And it's easily misinterpreted what that system is. I think that there's a folk sense that we have an alphabet and the Chinese system is based on pictures. And of course, there is an element of truth in that. But pictures alone would really only take a writing system so far. We saw, for example, that that was not what was going on, except in a very approximate sense, with Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it's the same way with the Chinese writing system. In fact, it's very reminiscent of hieroglyphics and cuneiform in that it's based on a combination of logographic symbols, and that is symbols that are based on pictures or that singly represent an idea, but then also linguistic elements. This is the Chinese writing system. So what is it when you see a sign written in Chinese? And if you can tell that what the sign says is something like fresh fish, and you think, well, they've got something for fresh and something for fish. What about if you have occasion to look over someone's shoulder if you're on a subway? You can see what city I probably live in. And you see that they are reading a book in Chinese. So it's not just fresh fish or savings bank, but it's brr, brr, brr. In other words, it's a whole writing system of a whole language. What is that stuff? What is on those pages? Well, the fact is that as far as we know, the earliest Chinese writing that is identifiable as directly related to the Chinese writing system is actually written on turtle shells and shoulder bones from oxen. It's it's called the Oracle Bone Script. And it dates from about 1200 BC. And what it is divinations and things. And so this is not people writing novels. It's not people writing savings bank or anything like that. Writing in this society was still something that was very ceremonial, very utilitarian, very elite. And so on these shells and bones, we see this system, which is clearly the direct precursor of Chinese of today. And what that means is the Chinese writing system is the oldest system still in use. Now, as we've seen, there are writing systems that are documented from before that, such as the Sumerian and the hieroglyphic that we saw. But the oldest one that's still in use is good old Chinese. Now, when you look at these, or if you were a little boy in the early 70s and you were taken to Chinatown by your parents and they gave you a little book called something like Chinese for Beginners and you learn a few of the very basic symbols, it's easy to think that boy was me. It's easy to think that what the Chinese system is just a bunch of pictures. And of course, to an extent, it is. And so there are elements like that, like here is the one for sun, and that looks kind of like a sun. And here's the one for moon. And they're very beautiful, aren't they? There's a calligraphy. That's not the subject of this lecture, but as you can see, it's quite an art to render these, much more than our kind of boring Roman alphabet. Or here is the symbol for mountain. You can see how that's a mountain. And so there's a relationship between these things and the things that they are, as you might predict. In earlier renditions of these symbols, they look more like what they are supposed to represent. So there are these pictograms. However, those pictograms are really only a sliver of the writing system. One estimate is 4% of the entire writing system, you can only get so far with that. So for example, if you're going to use these pictures, or even pictures of ideas, what would your picture of hint be? Hint. It's a very simple thing, and we all know what a hint is. Draw one. How are you going to do that? Or how would you draw a such? You want to say, such a good time, such an ancient script. How do you draw such? Have you ever seen a such running around? You can't. So clearly, there are more systems than we're going to need than that. And so, very often, there are combinations of symbols, as you might think. And so, if you combine the one for sun and moon, then you get bright. If you combine, and this, I did not make up the system. I know this is a little infelicitous, but if you combine a symbol for woman and another symbol for woman, then it means quarrel. Men fight too, but that is what the symbol is. So you have those combinations. But even that is only a sliver of the writing system, because even then, how would you combine two symbols to mean such? A mountain and a bicycle, that's clearly we need more than that. And so what the heart of the Chinese system is something kind of like what we saw with the hieroglyphics. You combine two different kinds of symbols, or in the terminology that's used, you combine two different kinds of radicals. And so there are about 300 of what are called semantic radicals. There are only really about 200 that are commonly used today. But these semantic radicals, these symbols, are used for common words like person or water or wood. Then these are combined with what are called phonetic determinatives. And what these represent, these symbols represent a sound. And so there is representation of sound in this writing system. And so if you look here at the way shake is indicated. Now, for example, how do you draw a shake? Now, it's easy to imagine drawing Dagwood with some lines or something, but that's clearly very local to American, pop drawing styles. How do you draw shake? Well, as it happens, in Chinese, there is a limited collection of syllables. It's all based on syllables that begin with a consonant, and for the most part, a vowel is all you've got at the end. Now, you might have an M or an N, but that's about it. There's only so much you can do with that, and so one syllable can mean an awful lot of things. So, for example, the syllable ao can mean all sorts of things in Chinese, and the difference is encoded partly by context, but especially by tone. But here we're talking about writing. And in terms of tone and writing, there are many ways that you can approach it. The way to write shake is that you use the phonetic determinative that means ao in the mind of anybody who's reading in this system. And then you combine that with the semantic radical for hand. And so it means the word pronounced ao that has to do with hand, and that will take you to shake. And so that's how this sort of thing works in Chinese. Most of what you would see somebody reading, if you're looking over their shoulder on the subway and they're reading a whole novel, what it is those kinds of combinations. And so all of that is very elegant, but it is also quite challenging in that Chinese, like any language, has changed over time. And so the correspondences are inexact. There's an inherent arbitrariness, for example, ao and then a hand, and well, it doesn't necessarily mean shaking. Why is it the hands shake? There are reasons hands might shake, but lots of things shake. It would work just as well if maybe it were a leaf, but it doesn't happen to be a leaf. You just happen to know. But then also sound change has made it a little messier. And so if we look in this chart at column A, and we see what happens to the phonetic symbol for ao and how you can show which ao is meant by using different semantic radicals, you see that if we put it into this chart, which is already simplifying things a bit, that it all looks very tidy. But then if we swoop over to column D and we illuminate it like this, we can see that things are really messier actually most of the time. And so here we have a phonetic determinative, which is fu. And we can see that if you use the fu that has to do with wood, and here's your semantic radical for wood, then you get the word for trellis. Okay, now notice that it's not log or, ski or something like that, but still trellis. It makes a certain sense. But then when you've got the phonetic determinative for fu and you combine it with hand, it means catch, and that's good, but the word now is actually pronounced bu, Or if you have the word pronounced fu that has to do with water, that's how they write creek. But the word today is not pronounced fu, it's pronounced pu, and so on. This sort of thing gets worse and worse and worse. And so there's an awful lot of things in the Chinese writing system that you have to know. What is on the page is best described as a guide to what is actually being communicated. And there are all sorts of things. Like, for example, this is the symbol for cat. And the semantic radical is the one used for animal. But that semantic radical actually means worm. And so the sign for cat, has to do with a worm. A cat's not a worm. What's cute about the sign for cat, though, is that it's pronounced mao. And that sounds kind of like meow. I'll bet there's a reason for that. But in any case, basic literacy in Chinese means that you have to know about 2,000 characters. There are technically about 50,000 of them, but of course that's getting into the very scholarly and or poetic registers. But one advantage of the Chinese writing system is that because of the way it's structured, it can be used for all of the Chinese varieties. So remember, we had a lecture where we talked about how the word for I is very different in all of the different varieties of Chinese, which are really separate languages and languages with often highly divergent dialects. So you look at all of these different words for I that you will find all over China. All of them can be written everywhere in China with this symbol. And so this is the symbol for wo in Mandarin. This is the symbol for ngo in Cantonese. This is the symbol for I. And that can be used across that great land. So that's how the Chinese system works. It's a marvelous mess, and I mean both of those words. It's a mess. I think most Chinese people would agree. It is also marvelous. It's a thing of great beauty. If you master it, which I have not, you have really accomplished quite a bit. It's wonderful to draw. And it's being compelling in that way has meant that it has actually affected the writing systems of many other places. And one of them is Japan. The Japanese writing system, talk about marvelous mess. Japanese writing system is a glorious nightmare. It is generally agreed to be one of the most complex, if not the most complex writing system in human civilization. It combines Chinese symbols, which in Japanese are called kanji, with not one, but two other writing systems used alongside of it. And so you've got the Chinese symbols, and that's why Japanese looks kind of like Chinese to us. But if you look over somebody's shoulder and it's like, and you see that, the way I do it is that you see that it's not as thick as Chinese. It seems like they're not all pictures, and you see this other stuff in it. That's when you know that the person is reading in Japanese, and it's because there are these two other systems. Both of them are syllabaries. They are not alphabetic systems. They indicate by syllable. One of them is called the hiragana, and it's used to indicate grammatical material. And in this course, you know what the difference is. There are content words, and then there is grammatical material. For example, walk, that's content. Walked, well, that is a grammatical ending. That sort of thing in Japanese is indicated not with pictures, not with logograms. That is indicated with the hiragana syllabary. And so, for example, our stereotypic Japanese sentence that we've used, Pam bought the book in Tokyo, Pam wa Tokyo ni hono katta. Well, the ta, for example, is their version of the ed ending. Bought is katta. The ta is indicated with the hiragana, even though there is a nice Chinese-derived kanji symbol for buy. And so that's the hiragana. Then there's another syllabary, whole different syllabary, whole different set of symbols called the katakana, and that's used to transcribe foreign words. And so you can see the katakana here, and they would use this to write things like, and now anything I think of ends up dating the course. So I'll just say Superman. Superman would be written in katakana, or well, let's date the course. Gerald Ford, when they were going to write about him, he was written about in katakana because there's no kanji, there's no Chinese symbol for Gerald Ford. And so you have these three different systems all working together. And so it's a marvelous thing that Japanese is read by people very casually. For example, this is Japanese for Kellogg's breakfast. And so Kellogg's is, of course, a foreign word, and so that is written in the katakana. And so these symbols are kerugugu. And so you have a double G, and so that's in there too. Now, that's in the katakana. Then this little thing that looks kind of like, well, it doesn't look like anything, but see this thing that's being highlighted? That is in hiragana because that's grammatical. It's a Kellogg's breakfast. Well, you put it that way in Japanese too. And so the th ending, although for them it's the separate word no, kerugo no. That no is a piece of grammar. That's written in hiragana. So these symbols are not all qualitatively the same. Even right here, we've got two different writing systems. And then for breakfast, you've got asagohan. And these look busier. These are originally from Chinese. And so the first one is asa, and that's morning. And you can see that there's a kind of a sun in it. And then there is gohan. And if you think that this little thing here looks kind of like a rice cooker, then that can help your memory because actually this does mean rice. Morning rice is how you say breakfast because obviously there is a certain riceness about the culture. And so here you have the katakana and the hiragana and the kanji all used just in some tacky ad just to say Kellogg's breakfast. You need all of that stuff. And so Japanese it's got these three different systems. And then in addition, there is the Chinese issue and pronunciation. And what I mean by that is that there are as many as 60% in Japanese Chinese words. That was not phrased properly. There, in the Japanese language, about 60% of the vocabulary is originally from Chinese due to previous relationship. And that is why there are all these kanji in the Japanese system. And it ends up creating problems like this. Here is the Japanese symbol for rain. Now here it is. It's my favorite one. See how it's rain being seen through the window. Isn't that pretty? It's like you're inside. That is pronounced ame. That's the Japanese version. Now, if you want to write downpour, then you end up having this symbol. Now you see that the rain is still there, and then that first symbol means big. However, the problem is that this time, when we're looking at it in this particular way, it has to be pronounced in the Chinese way. That's just the way it is. Now, the Chinese way to pronounce this rain symbol happens to be u. Now, this thing in the front means big. There's a Japanese word for big, oki, but in Chinese it's pronounced tai in Japanese, and therefore you pronounce this tayu. There's no ame at all. So the symbols are recognizable, but this rainy day window has a whole different pronunciation when it's in one of the Chinese pronunciation words. And these are things that you just have to know, and nevertheless, there are people in Japan reading all the time under no impression that there is anything really impressive about what they are doing. But there very much is. It is really something to me that there is enough diversity in human nature that this can be a writing system that doesn't hurt people. And so that's Japanese. Now, if I mention the Japanese writing system, I know what you're wondering. I know what the natural sequence of these things is, and we know our geography. So let us go across the sea, and now we're in Korea. Now, they do a whole different thing with their writing system. It's called Hangul, and it is syllabically based as well. And so if you see Korean, and if you want to know the difference between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and I think a modern American citizen might want to, Chinese looks real busy. Japanese has these kind of simpler syllabary symbols in it. Korean is completely different. Korean has the look that you see here. What you see here is bada, and that means sea. And so you have a symbol for the syllable ba and a symbol for the syllable da. And of course, you can have symbols for consonants independently by themselves. And so with wind, you've got ba-lam, and you see that you have la up top, and then we've got this little square in here, and that means And so you've got these two syllables. And based on this principle, you could write heap hop. I don't think they do. Well, maybe they do. If you were going to do it, you would do it this way, where you have heap hop in these two kind of squares here. Now, of course, in the way the alphabet is written, you don't have these squares, but what you have is these signs for different syllables. And so that's how the Korean writing system works. So Chinese is Chinese, Japanese is the one with three systems all working together, and then Korean is a whole different kind of symbols. Those are not kanji, those are not hiragana or katakana. Another writing system is the Arabic one. This is also one that we see around us all of the time, and it can look quite impenetrable, and it's not. Not only is it beautiful, but it's actually quite systematic. It's relatively easy to understand once you wrap your mind around certain differences that we don't necessarily expect. The Arabic writing system is one that has been, for about the past 12 years, called an abjad, and that means that the signs generally refer to consonants rather than vowels. Abjad comes from the fact that while we talk about our ABCs in the alphabet, the abjad is the way that you do the Arabic alphabet in some situations, and so abjad. And so he wrote in Arabic is katab. And so you see this k, t, b. Now you just have to know that there is this ah. Now, there are ways of indicating long vowels. In Arabic, there are long and short vowels, and it's an important distinction. And so, for example, the word for book is kitab with a long ah. And here is how that's indicated. And you can see that there is, in addition to the k, t, and the b, in between the t and the b, you've got this indication, which is for ah. That's only for long ah, though. As far as the short vowels, there are symbols. That is mainly used in religious or highly explicit writing. In general, you are just supposed to know when it comes to the short vowels. And that works. That seems perfectly natural to Arabic speakers, and it is. It's just a different way of indicating things than the alphabetic system. What challenges some people about learning the Arabic writing system is that the letters occur in different forms depending on whether they are in isolation, whether they're at the beginning of the word, whether they're at the end of it, or whether they're in the middle. And so you can look at how there is this letter for B at the end of the previous two words. And so you see this sort of, I guess you'd call it a bathtub with a dot under it. But then here's how you write the Arabic language. And so al-Arabiya. And you see that where the B is supposed to be, it's a different kind of shape. And so when many people talk about Arabic being hard, it's because the layman often thinks of the writing as the language. And what does throw people at the beginning is these different forms of the letters. And it can get rather noisome to the foreigner. And so, for example, here for the glottal stop, which is indicated in Arabic in a way that it isn't in English. Like, notice what I just said, which is indicated. I didn't say which is indicated. I said which is indicated. I actually did the glottal stop. Well, in Arabic, you actually have to indicate that in the writing. And if it's alone, it looks like this. If it's first, then it looks like this, completely different. If it's in the middle, then, oh Lord, you got that. And if it's at the end, then, well, it's completely different. And so you do have to master that. It's not as hard as it looks, though. And once you have mastered that, the Arabic writing system has a very pleasing grace to it, especially if you're coming to it as something exotic from our alphabetic system. As I'm sure you all know, it also can be quite beautiful. It's worth learning how to read it. It's all around us these days, and to actually look at it written and have those words say something instead of it looking like, which is what it does look like to us, is a very gratifying experience. In any case, we have seen that it can be very difficult to untangle what a non-alphabetic writing system is, and we've seen what went into figuring out how hieroglyphics were representative of language. However, even a syllabary can be difficult to figure out. And so, for example, the decipherment of what's called Linear B, which was found on Crete, was an interesting story. It used to be thought, and this is by perfectly sophisticated people, that if you were reading the Iliad or the Odyssey, that these were just mythical events, that none of this stuff ever happened. So just like hieroglyphics were thought to be just kind of impressionistic pictures of thoughts and that's it, it was thought that people had made up these stories, but it had nothing to do with actual life. But Heinrich Schliemann found in the 1800s that there were remains on Troy near Turkey which actually indicated these kinds of events. And also in the Mycenaean region in Greece. And Sir Arthur Evans, who was a British archaeologist, picked up this ball and ran with it. He wanted to know more about these things happening in Greece. And this would have been between about 1500 and 1100 BC. And he concentrated on Crete. And what he found was that there were remains of a Greek civilization, the Mycenaean civilization. But if you dug, literally dug, then you found that there were obvious remains of a different and in many ways more advanced civilization that is known as the Minoan civilization. And one of the traits of these Minoan remains were these tablets, and here was this script, and there it was, Linear B, it came to be called. Now, the first thought was that Linear B was some lost Cretan language. Now, they even found remains of it over in Greece later, too, but it was still thought that this was some sort of Cretan language, and it was thought that it must have reflected that language because the Minoan civilization looked in many ways more advanced than the Mycenaean. There were big debates over this. And then people started looking at Linear B, and they started realizing that it might be possible to interpret what it actually said. And there was some interesting, ingenious work done. For example, Alice Kober was a Brooklyn College classicist. And that name sounds like what it was. If your name is Alice Kober, Kober, you were a Brooklyn College classicist in the 1930s and 40s, which is what she was. And she thought about the fact that an alphabet tends to have, say, 20 to 40 symbols. For example, in English, that's the way it is. If you are a syllabary, and of course many syllabaries were known even then, just like they are now, then chances are that you have about 90. The chances are that you have 50 to 100 symbols. And Linear B had 90. And so Alice Kober thought, well, maybe this is a syllabary. And how are we going to figure out what these words mean? Well, she noticed that you could see triplets of words that were clearly related, like up here on the screen. And so if you're seeing Linear B and you don't know what it indicates, you do see that there's some sort of relationship here. One of those symbols does look like a daiquiri, and we now know that it was actually the indication of ki, the syllable ki, but yes, it looks like a daiquiri. Anyway, there is these triplets. Now, one thing that Alice Kober came up with, and this was really something, given that she went from nothing. She figured it must be that this is a language with endings. And so her idea was, suppose, for example, that it was something like this. And so you have pasadanu, pasadani, pasadu. Now, all endings don't have to be the same length, but she thought if that's true, then we know that the third member in these triplets must begin with the same consonant. Now, that's something, certainly from nothing. Then she noticed, well, there are these other cases where you have what looks like it would be the same ending, but then the third members are different. And so, for example, you would see triplets like this. She thought, well, maybe that means that it's the same endings, but that then this third syllable begins with a different consonant than in the set of first triplets. And so you might have, say, pasadanu and then hiruwanu, like that. And so she came up with this insight that must be the sort of thing that's going on. Now, she didn't know what the syllables were, and unfortunately, before she could figure it out, and I'm pretty sure that she would have figured it out, she was carried away from us by a disease. And so it stopped there for a bit. But then there was Michael Ventris. He was a young architect. If you were a young architect in the middle of the 20th century, then your name definitely was going to be Michael Ventris. And you can see pictures of him. He looked kind of glamorous. He looks like he was going to play James Bond. If he had lived so long, that was just some foreshadowing. But in any case, he thought if this is a syllabary, then there must be signs for just vowels. So there's no language where everything is a consonant and a vowel. There are languages, in any language, you're going to have syllables like a, e, I, o, u all alone as well. And he figured, and this was good too, he figured he was not just an empty, pretty face. He figured you would find those at the beginning of a word. And so it's probably going to be something like okahan. I'm just making up that word. So he looked around and he saw one word that seemed to come up again and again. And he thought, well, what is an important place in the area that might come up again and again and again? And there are only so many. And he thought, well, what about omnisos? That's one place. And that begins with a vowel. And so he thought, well, you know, if this spelled omnisos, then this symbol would be omniso, something like that. And then he noticed that there was another word that had this same symbol that he was thinking might mean so. And then using the Alice Kober style deduction, he figured out that there were some other signs that would have had the same vowel in them based on this same deduction about what might endings be. And so he thought, well, then this word is going to be so. Now, what does that fit? Well, there was the city Knossos. And so he decided this must be so. And so then he thought, well, if that's what those mean, then what's this little word that you always see at the bottom of the tablets? There was toso, tosa. Those mean total in Greek. And so Michael Ventris had figured out that this Linear B script was not decoration and not some strangely missing Cretan tongue, but that it actually was the Greek language. Specifically, it was Greek 500 years before the previously earliest known stage of Greek, our familiar classical Greek that Homer wrote in. And so Michael Ventris figured this out and died in a car accident. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. And in the next lecture, we will take a look at a language which is effectively unwritten, and we will see what it's like to actually be a linguist.